A famous medium evokes the spirit of a boy right on stage. He deceives a gullible woman, but everyone in the room believes what is happening. Philip Goodman takes the stage. This is a well-known skeptic who exposes swindlers like this medium. Philip talks about death and says that people are ready to believe in the afterlife because they are very afraid of death and the unknown. He doesn't believe in otherworldly forces or ghosts at all. Goodman cites the example of Dr. Charles Cameron, who was one of the first skeptics of paranormal debunkers. An old recording shows Charles talking to a woman who was allegedly possessed by a spirit, but he exposed the story and became famous. Goodman watched the show as a child and became a fan of Charles's work, but one day, Charles strangely disappeared and was never seen again. Philip regrets that they were unable to meet. One ordinary day, Professor Goodman receives a letter. He inserts the tape and receives an invitation from Charles Cameron to meet. Goodman immediately hits the road. Within a day, he arrives at the address indicated in the letter. He is greeted by an aged Charles. Goodman is surprised that Charles is still alive, but Charles asks, "Are you sure about this?" But it was a joke. Goodman tries to express gratitude for what Charles did before. He admits to being a fan, but Charles stops him. He thinks that he worked poorly and was incompetent in many aspects of his work. He scolds Goodman's book and gives him a folder of documents. Charles says that in his entire career, he has never been able to solve 3 cases. And I came to the conclusion that ghosts and the other world exist. He asks to solve these cases. Goodman leaves and thinks Charles is crazy. He turns around to look at the house, but he sees a strange silhouette standing next to Charles in the window. Philip arrives for the first case. He is greeted by a man named Tony. Philip tries to talk about what happened, but the man agrees only for payment of £50. Previously, the man worked as a night watchman. He says that he used to be married, but his wife died a long time ago. Goodman asks if he has children, but Tony aggressively replies that he doesn't want to talk about it. Goodman offers even more money and the man accepts. He says that he has a daughter. She is now 30 years old. Now she is in the hospital, and she is completely paralyzed and may not even be able to think. And finally, the man begins to tell the basic story. He worked as a watchman in the old rear building. It all happened at almost 4 o'clock in the morning. There used to be a women's mental hospital in that building. It was a disgusting place. Previous watchmen quit this job. They said that they saw something terrible. Goodman asks if Tony believed them. Tony replies that he should have believed them. That night at almost 4 a.m., Tony is drinking coffee and listening to the radio. A watchman from another building contacts him via radio. Marek is new and asks Tony what he should do at work. Tony quickly explains everything and goes back to listening to the program on the radio. But suddenly, the electricity in the entire building goes out. Tony goes to check the generator and sees that it is turned off. He turns it back on and returns to his desk, but he notices that his mug is on the floor. He sits down on a chair, but the light goes out again. He goes to the generator again and notices scratches on the casing. Tony turns on the lights and decides to check the room. He thinks that someone has entered the back and is trying to play a trick on him.
Hello?
Tony begins to worry a little. He contacts Marek on the radio and asks if he's just entered the building. Marek answers, no. Marek says that he doesn't like this place. He feels something bad here. Tony reassures his partner and says that he will return in 10 minutes after checking the premises. He goes deeper into the building and finds another generator. Tony turns on the light and walks down the narrow corridor. All these doors lead to former chambers where mentally ill people lay. He gets up to smoke, and at that moment the lights begin to go out one by one. Tony begins to walk into the darkness and asks who is there. Tony returns to his workplace and tries to contact Marek, but a little girl answers on the radio. Someone starts knocking on the door. Tony takes the hammer and opens the door, but there is no one at the door. He goes further and notices a man against the wall. He comes closer, but it turns out to be a mop. He hears someone running behind him. He goes down and sees that someone has broken the generator. Tony thinks that someone got into the back ones. He reaches room 92, the chain falls, and the door opens. Tony comes inside for some reason. He notices someone in the corner and decides to come closer. The door closes. Tony tries to open the door, but he can't. A scary girl appears next to him and calls him Daddy. Professor Goodman visits the local priest and asks his opinion about Tani's story. The priest says that he trusts him completely and says that it is a miracle that brought the man to God. Afterwards, Goodman visits his friend. A young guy named Simon meets a professor at his home. The boy turns out to be very strange. Simon asks Goodman to wait for him at the door, but the professor walks a little further down the corridor. He sees Simon's parents. They stand and just stare at the wall. Simon allows the professor to go upstairs. Goodman notices a strange photograph that we must remember. Goodman goes up the stairs and hears a car. He sees someone in the room and thinks it's Simon, but Simon comes up behind him and says they need to go downstairs. Simon locks the door to the room and says that he is tired of constantly living in fear. He says that everyone might think he's crazy, but he doesn't think so. Goodman asks, who lives upstairs? Simon says that his brother used to live there, but now there is no one there. Goodman doesn't believe him because he definitely saw someone. Simon opens the door and suggests checking, but Goodman refuses. Suddenly, someone starts knocking on the door. Simon chases away the one who is standing behind the door. Goodman thinks it was the boy's parents. He asks to start telling his story. Simon was driving at night in his father's car. He was returning from a party. Simon's parents call him on his phone and start scolding him for not answering the calls. He tries to justify his actions, but his parents are still unhappy. The phone signal constantly disappears because there is a dense forest around. Simon is briefly distracted and hits someone with his car. He gets out of the car and sees a strange creature. He gets into his car in a panic and drives away. But the dashboard in the car starts to go out and the engine dies. Simon tries to call, but there is no connection. He's very scared, but he gets out of the car to catch the signal. Simon calls roadside assistance for help. They tell him that they will arrive within 40 minutes. Simon gets back into the car. He is crying and very scared, but something hits his car from outside. Simon asks, "Who is there?" But there was no answer. Simon runs into the forest and stumbles upon a huge tree. The tree comes to life and grabs the guy. Goodman comes to this place to look at the tree. He thinks that the boy imagined everything in the dark. He returns to the car and sees himself in it. Goodman meets with Michael. Michael says that he used to be a trader. One day he hit the jackpot and built himself a big house. At that moment, his wife suggested having a child, but Maria was already 40 years old. But she still got pregnant. Michael takes Goodman on a hunt. They take a gun to shoot birds. He continues to tell stories about how his wife became pregnant, but suddenly began bleeding internally. That day, Michael was at home all alone. He didn't know what to do with himself and decided to go to the children's room that he had built quite recently. He decides to clean up a little, but something strange begins to happen in the room. Michael thinks it's just a draft. Michael asks Goodman, "What was that? Spirit or poltergeist?" Goodman says ghosts don't exist, and suddenly he sees a strange man without a face and in a hood. Michael asks if Goodman killed anyone. Goodman replies that he never killed. Michael continues his story. At night he hears noise from the children's room. He goes there and sees a sheet flying in the lullaby. The temperature in the room begins to drop below zero. He sees Maria. After a while, they called from the hospital and said that Maria had died. Michael suddenly stops talking and looks towards Goodman. Then he shoots himself in the head. Goodman, in complete shock, goes to see Professor Charles. He says he understood what was happening. Goodman thinks it's all a hoax, so Charles can return to television. But Charles calls Goodman a fool who is unable to believe what is happening. The old man begins to remove the mask from his face. Michael laughs at Goodman and tears up the scenery. They enter a strange black door. Michael says this is Goodman's last chance to admit what he did. They come to the sewer drains. 2 school children call Goodman names and ask him to come to them. They force young Goodman to stand against a wall and hold a bottle to his face. But the bully doesn't have time to throw the stone. Another schoolboy arrives. The guy turns out to be sick. The hooligans decide to have some fun and invite the boy to join their gang. But to do this, he needs to climb into the sewer. The guy immediately agrees, but soon he says that he is scared and wants to go outside. The bully forbids him to leave until he finds the number. The boy becomes ill, begins to choke and falls. The hooligans run away. Goodman also decides to run away. Michael asks why he left the guy to die.
I wasn't the one who made him go in there. I did nothing.
That's right, you did nothing.
Michael disappears, but the ghost of a boy in a hood appears. Goodman begs not to touch him. The ghost tears off his clothes and leads him along. They come to the mental hospital ward. Goodman lies down in bed, and the zombie climbs on top of him and puts his finger in his mouth. It turns out that Goodman was in a coma all this time. Simon comes into his room. He works at this hospital. Michael comes into the room. He is Goodman's attending physician. Michael reads out the patient's card and says that Goodman attempted suicide, tried to suffocate in the car. Michael jokingly says that he should have used a gun. Simon says that this is a deep coma and it is not known whether the patient can hear them. The last person to enter the room is Tawny, the janitor. He washes the floor and leaves. Goodman is left lying in the ward alone with his ghosts. And this is where the film ends. Write your opinion about this in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell to be the first to watch new videos.